In this long-awaited and much requested video, I'll be showing you the process of how I carve porcelain maker's marks. These are the objects I stamp into the bases of my pots, and it's through this that people can identify which pots I've made. I use a variety of tools for making these, but perhaps the most important is a very sharp knife or razor blade like this. The other is a potter's needle, preferably one with a very sharp, fine tip, which this bison one has. And I'd say that most other common potter's needles most likely aren't sharp or fine enough to do this job, in which case I recommend using a sewing needle. I also occasionally use a paring knife and a number of different metal kidneys. I also keep a jug of water nearby, which I'll use to grind the ends of the stamps flat. I also occasionally use this tool, the origins of which I can't be quite sure of, but on one end it has a tiny sharp gouge, which is very useful when carving slightly bigger stamps. But for the size I want, it's still a bit too large, and it can leave corners that are a bit too rounded. I have a whole variety of maker's marks, which I store in this leather pouch made by my friend and leather worker, Mark Tallowan. I use the smallest of these stamps to mark the feet on the smallest bowls I make. There's a variety of reasons for why I use porcelain, the first being that it shrinks the most out of any other clay, from 15 to 20% from wet clay to finally fired in the gas kiln. This means that you can carve your stamps slightly larger than need be, and then they'll shrink considerably as they dry out and as they're fired. It's also very smooth, which makes carving these finer details easier, and porcelain is also exceedingly strong and durable. Here's one of my old worksheets, a page of ideas where I try and combine an F and a G. Of course you don't have to use your initials as a maker's mark, it's just what's commonly done. It could equally be a symbol, or you can even just scratch your signature into the base of the pot. There's no one way that's better than another. Stamps are just the traditional way of signing your pots. So, let's begin. I start with some porcelain. The amount you need really just depends on the amount of stamps you want to make. I took the block, and as this piece was a bit dry, I wet it and then patted it into shape. If you have a slab roller, I recommend using that, but essentially all I want at this stage is a slab that's about 1 centimetre thick, and by no means does it need to be perfect, as the only vital area is going to be the face on which we carve. Now you can either leave this slab out to dry out naturally to leather hard, or you can do what I did, which was blast it with a heat gun for a couple of minutes, until it's more or less leather hard, and then use a sharp straight edge kidney to divide this piece into blanks that are about 4 or 5 centimetres long and 1 centimetre wide. Each blank is quite large at this point, and it's here that my general advice begins, which is always work with slightly more material than you need, rather than using too little from the get-go. Ultimately, the size you cut these really depends on what kind of size stamp you want. I was in the need for some really small ones, hence the small size of these, but I've always had a preference for a smaller maker's mark, symbols that are simple and are easy to read, which is why my own mark ended up being a simple little F. If you do make small maker's marks, you really need the symbol to be readable even when pushed into textured clay, and you'll find if your mark has lots of lines and curves that weave and flow, they can quite quickly become unrecognisable. Yet, you also want them to be unique to yourself and recognisable as just yours, which can be difficult in the beginning. But as you grow renown for being a potter, people will associate your mark with your pots, and it can even get to the point where changing your mark can be detrimental. Anyway, these are the shapes for the blanks I aim for, and whilst they're still slightly wet, I use a hole piercer to make a hole in one end of them, which means when they're all fired and done, I can attach cordage to the end of them, or string them all up together, anything really which makes them harder to lose. I'll then let these blanks sit out for a bit longer, or give them another blast with the heat gun. As for when it comes to actually carving the symbol, I want these to be more or less bone dry, perhaps just on the very, very firm end of leather hard. I don't mind that they're all a bit different, or a bit scruffy. At the end of the day, it's only the very end, the mark, that counts. And I quite like the fact that they look like they've been carved by hand, rather than being made or printed by machine, which I've always thought to be a strange way of finishing off a handmade pot. And in my opinion, it's much nicer to have the maker's hand involved in the stamps that are used, and it makes it all much more personal. Now, I need to make sure that the surface I'm carving is more or less perfectly flat, which you can see this one isn't quite, as it dips forward on this corner slightly. To fix this, I take my maker's mark and I dunk the end in water. I then hold the mark very firmly and rub it against the wooden tabletop, which is abrasive enough to grind the surface flat when combined with water. I'll then carefully remove any excess slip from around the edge, and once that's done, I'll set this piece aside as the end is now too wet and sodden to carve. I also gently use a fingertip just to remove any slip that remains on the top, but I make sure not to push firm enough as to indent the top. I then proceed with all the other stamps. This is also the method I use if I make a mistake when I'm carving. If I make an error or chip away some of the clay, or I'm simply not happy with the mark itself, I'll just dunk the end in water and grind away a millimetre or two until I've got a clean slate which is ready to be carved again. This might sound obvious, but when you're carving your maker's mark, it needs to be the reflection of what you ultimately want, as the mark is reversed when you stamp it. So when you do carve your symbol, make sure you carve it reflected. Here's a rough before and after, just to show you how much it shrinks. You can also easily see just how much material I have to work with, and there is a reason for this. I begin by carving my symbol into the middle of this larger block, and I purposefully leave a lot of excess space all around the mark, as the almost bone-dry porcelain at this stage is very brittle, and if I shave down the borders of the stamp before actually carving the symbol, the process of carving the symbol would probably cause the nice clean border to chip or fracture. But by shaving away the border after the symbol has been made, I don't run that risk, and having the thick border all the way around also means that I don't need to be quite so careful as I'm carving. So to begin with, I use a pencil to lightly sketch my backwards maker's mark. If the graphite sinks into the porcelain, that means your clay is probably a bit too soft. The marks you make don't need to be this small, but for a while I've wanted one this size to stamp the lower facet of the smallest bowls I make. I clasp the blank tightly, and then I very carefully use the tip of the needle just to carve the first pass into the porcelain. I work very slowly, and I make all my movements very definite, and I'm the most careful when carving two lines that intersect, as those tend to be the most likely parts for the porcelain to chip. For the time being, I'm mostly concerned with depth, so I'll slowly grind the porcelain away bit by bit. I want the grooves to be about 1.5 millimeters deep, but I won't try to carve away to that exact depth in one fell swoop. As with brittle, bone-dry clay, it's when you try to remove too much material at once when things begin to chip and go wrong. Corners tend to be the most difficult sections to carve out. I tend to push my needle in a few times to create a deeper spot, and then I carve out from that in either direction. If you can't see what you're doing, as the clay burrs accumulate around the mark, I'll either blow a gust of air over it, or very gently rub over the carved area with my fingertip. Once I'm happy with the depth, I'll then begin to carve away at the inside walls of the mark, making them straighter and neater, and delicately gliding the tip of the needle along the side of the indentation. As I carve, I'm resting the base of the blank against the wooden tabletop, whilst my thumb and fingers of my left hand very tightly clasp the mark in place. At the same time, I don't let my wrist of my right hand float free. It's also resting firmly against the tabletop, which helps to keep my fingers steady as I carve. Once I'm happy with my symbol, I then take my razor blade and I begin to slowly fettle away much of the excess porcelain that surrounds the mark. And just like before, I remove the clay gradually, slowly decreasing the size of the border all the way around the stamp until it's the size I want. I find that smaller maker's marks tend to leave nicer impressions in the clay, and the sharp blade leaves a lovely clean edge that'll sink easily into your finished pots. And as this is porcelain, even with these fine edges, once fired, it'll be very strong, although they may of course chip if dropped. Once the borders are to my liking, I'll neaten up the rest of the stamp. This isn't something that's totally necessary, but I do it for my own sake. The most important thing at this stage is to make sure that the edges of the stamp are really crisp, and perhaps the only smoothing I do is a very gentle go over with my fingertips. And that's the mark finished mostly. I will clean up the handles somewhat, and potentially even glaze them when they're fired to 1300 degrees Celsius, a process that will cause these stamps to shrink really dramatically. And now that the handle's been refined, I can test it, which I do by lightly pushing it into some porcelain, rocking it from corner to corner so that it leaves a nice impression. If at this point you notice any parts of your mark look inconsistent, such as the depth or the width of the mark, then there is still time to correct it, and you can even test your mark to see if it's legible before you even carve the border around it. Just make sure you don't test it too much at this stage, as repeated stamping can cause the leather hard clay to deteriorate slightly, losing its definition and clarity. I also remade one of my oldest stamps, which is this interlocking F and G, which I carved in exactly the same way as my other mark. If you are making a batch of these, I recommend making more than one. They're easy things to lose, and you won't know exactly how they'll work until they've been fired, so it's better to hedge your bets and make a few. You can of course also use stoneware to make these. You'll just want to make sure you're using a very smooth clay, as if the clay contains any grog or particles of sand, it'll make this carving process exceedingly more difficult, as if your needle hits into one of those while working, it can cause a chunk of clay around it to be torn away, ruining your careful work. It also won't shrink as much as porcelain, but that's something you only really need to worry about if you're like me and want to have very small, discreet maker's marks. Together with refining the sides of the indentation, I also spend more time refining the ends of the marks, where the lines come to a stop, such as the bottom of the F or the two arms. I lightly carve these conclusions so that they have two corners too, as opposed to coming to a tapering point, which is what happens when using a tool like this. So I attempt to make the ends at least slightly squared off. This way I think it leaves a more clearly refined stamp. Then it's back to the razor blade and refining the border. I like to cut these sides so they're a sharp right angle, as opposed to having sides that slope outwards slightly, as I feel it makes the stamp stand out more clearly, and I feel as if it also makes it easier to apply and push into leather hard clay. Ultimately, there are dozens of ways of making marks. You could have your symbol raised and the clay all around it removed. That way when you push it into the clay, all that's left is your symbol, without a border or anything surrounding it. In a similar way to how I trim the bases and the footrings of my bowls to match the exacting claywork above it, I feel that having a very defined, exacting maker's mark matches that whole aesthetic. If at this point I make a mistake and chip away some of the mark itself or ruin the borders around it, I'll either remove this whole portion of the stamp, if there's enough porcelain left to allow that, and once again I'll dunk the top in water and grind it perfectly flat against the tabletop. If there isn't enough clay left in the blank, it's probably best to discard it and start another, hence why I always make more blanks than I need. And if I don't get around to using all of them, well, there's always other uses for them, as stamps don't always necessarily need to be maker's marks. In fact, you can carve anything in them, and they can be a really nice way of decorating the outside surface of a pot, especially when glazes pool into them. Once these stamps are finished, I'll pack and bisque fire them alongside all my other pots. Some potters will use them only bisque fired, but I prefer to then glaze fire them as well, as they shrink down even further. I'll even glaze the handle portion, firing them upright, with the mark itself embedded in a pile of wadding to support it and to protect it from the glaze, which is exactly what I did with this old one, which I made and was solidified during my apprenticeship with Lisa Hammond, and those stamps now are some of my most prized possessions. Anyway, I hope this video inspires some of you to give it a go and to make your own maker's marks. There's something that's much more personal about it, as compared to the plastic and metal 3D printed ones you might find online. This is, after all, your signature, essentially, and even though it is a stamp, and therefore it's replicated time and time again, perfectly, like a handwritten signature isn't, it's still much more personal and reflects the maker. In the same way a painter wouldn't get somebody else to sign their paintings for them, I think it's only right that it comes from the potter's hand, as opposed to somebody else's. Here are all the maker's marks I carved in this session. There's a few larger and smaller variants, together with some symbols for some other projects. And I'll now be really careful about how I handle these and pack them into the kiln, as delicate bone-dry clay on this scale will break or chip with the most gentle of knocks. Beyond just being very meticulous as you work, having some good tools can really help for this process. Some kind of sharp blade for carving away the border is a tremendous help, and a good fine-tipped tool like this bison potter's needle is utterly invaluable. And I just want to take this moment to thank you all so much for helping my channel surpass 1 million subscribers. It's truly a surreal number, and in no way did I ever expect to hit that milestone in just 2 years of making videos. So thank you for sticking around and for watching, for leaving comments and for liking. I'm so glad these films have been useful for so many people, and reading through all your kind comments makes the process of putting these films together feel so very worthwhile. So thank you again, and I'll see you next week.